Reporting. Joining us here now in Washington is Cuban broadcast journalist Cristina Escobar, and with us from Havana is the Cuban diplomat and educator Carlos Alzugaray. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Ambassador Alzugaray, let me start with you. If you could put this in some kind of perspective for us. When we look at the recent history of Cuban-American relations, we look at the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, we look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, we look at the Mariel boat lift in 1980. It's a very tempestuous relationship, a very controversial relationship. So when we look at the events of today, how significant is what happened today?
It's very significant. This is a historic event because both President Raúl Castro and President Obama, with boldness, courage, and vision, decided to stop the madness of having two neighborly countries who have had a traditional close relationship have no diplomatic relations at all. Of course, there's a lot of work to do after the reestablishment of diplomatic relations, but you know what? Both presidents have put in first place diplomatic relations. Usually, what happens in these instances is that you work out the normalization of relations and then you have diplomatic relations. Very smartly, I would say, they put diplomatic relations first, which would allow both governments to talk to each other. As to those who oppose that, I think they're swimming against the current of history. The current of history is moving towards these two countries to have a good relationship, as they should have.
Cristina, a historic day today. We saw the Cuban flag being raised outside the embassy there. But what kind of immediate changes can we expect to see in the relationship between Cuba and the United States? And most importantly, I mean, how will this benefit ordinary Cubans?
I wouldn't say that a lot, or none, actually. I don't think we won't be able to see a lot of changement for the common people, like myself, in Cuba, because this is a diplomatic moment, a symbolic, historic moment where actually the blockade or embargo, as you call it, is still in place, and the main sanctions and the laws, because there are laws, legislations that affect the Cuban people in terms of accessing the American technology, the American business community, is still in place. So we won't see that happening any moment now.
So I guess, as you know, the ambassador pointed out, there's still major challenges that remain. Ambassador, you know, the Cuban Foreign Minister, Bruno Rodriguez, he's in Washington right now. He was here for the opening of the embassy. He later addressed a news conference with the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry at the U.S. State Department. I want you to take a listen to somewhat what he had to say.
I emphasize that the total lifting of the blockade, the return of the illegally occupied territory of Guantanamo, as well as the full respect for the Cuban sovereignty and the compensation to our people for human and economic damages are crucial to be able to move towards the normalization of relations.
So, Ambassador, as we hear there are enormous challenges ahead in this relationship. Do you believe that those challenges will be overcome?
I certainly do. I think that this is going to happen eventually. But I think the two governments have done something very smart. By reestablishing diplomatic relations, they are talking to each other. They're making their government officials talk to each other. This will mean that on a number of issues of what I would call low politics, both governments are working together. And that will have a spillover effect. As relations start to move in these, let's say, low politics, counter-narcotics, environmental protection, civil aviation security, as these issues tend to be solved, there will be a tendency, an inevitable tendency, to have a better relationship. And that will work against the forces who want to keep the embargo in place, even though it has demonstrated to be a total failure. So Americans are pragmatic. I think in the long run, and the majority of Americans are saying so. As a matter of fact, the majority of Cuban Americans are also saying so. They want a normal relation between Cuba and the United States. Yes, the obstacles are very great. Nobody thinks that these are going to be solved overnight, but the first steps are being taken. I will be reminded of the Chinese proverb, every long journey begins with a small step. I think the steps are not so small. Taking Cuba off the terrorism list, reestablishing of diplomatic relations, reopening of the embassies. If someone had told me that that was going to happen, let's say, on December 15, I would have laughed. That couldn't happen. Well, it happened. So why not think positively that all these issues are going to be resolved eventually?
Right, Cristina, at that very same news conference, John Kerry, the US Secretary of State, also addressed the media. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Make no mistake, the process of fully normalizing relations between the United States and Cuba will go on. It may be long and complex, but along the way, we are sure to encounter a bump here and there, and moments even of frustration. Patience will be required.
So, Kerry, they're sounding somewhat optimistic, but given, the challenges that you pointed out just now, as well as the challenge that exists on Capitol Hill, laws have to be changed to lift the embargo, to change travel restrictions. Do you think that optimism is justified?
Well, I was listening to Professor Alzugaray, Ambassador Alzugaray, and he's writing something. Americans tend to be very pragmatic, but we haven't seen that pragmatism in the last 55 years. And I think John Kerry is. I wouldn't be that optimistic. I told you that before and in a previous show. I wouldn't be that optimistic due to the fact that nothing happens in the Congress nowadays. I mean, things that are supposed to be solved in the Congress, not related to the foreign affairs issues, but I'm talking about things that are dealing with the society, with the American society, is not getting their way through, their solutions there. So I think it's going to be a hard way still in that sense to actually see if something changes. There are a lot of very powerful congresswomen and men that are still in place, Cuban American, that has made this part of the way they live politics, and the people that sponsors them actually live out of an anti-Castro industry. And that's still in place, even though there's some groups, lobbyist groups, that are trying, for example, to tackle the travel ban situation, the fact that Americans can't go to Cuba to do tourism or go in general. They have to apply for some licenses. And the fact that it's impossible still for the American community to go to Cuba. Even the things that the President Obama said December 17th that put into law in January 16th through the Treasury Department legislation are not happening, a lot of them, because there's contradictions with the blockade legislation, and that's important. In 1996, the Helms-Burton was passed in the Congress, and that meant in that moment that the embargo, which were executive orders, became law. And in that moment, the President Clinton in that moment took out the possibility of lifting embargo out of the president. That's why the President Obama can't lift the embargo today, and that's a congressional issue, even though it has to do with foreign issues, foreign policy. And so there are a lot of things in the way, and it takes time.
All right. And if we look at what's going on Capitol Hill, I agree with you that it does seem to be a bit gridlocked there as far as Congress is concerned. But I think the other thing, Cristina, we should not forget is that there is the business lobby here in the United States, which will be pushing very hard to get that embargo lifted.
Yeah, it is, but they're still measuring the benefits, if they're actually getting the amount of benefits to go into this kind of enterprise in Cuba. And there are a lot of opportunities. Cuba changed the foreign investment law. There are a lot of opportunities, growing, small entrepreneur, private sector growing every day. And it's actually growing very fast in Cuba. But there's still, the embargo does not allow yet actually to the American community to go there. So it's a process. It's a process. It's not something, I mean, what are the benefits? The Americans, I'll say, what I'm going to earn there and what I might be risking if I do it. So that kind of equation is not still in favor of this situation.
Cost benefit not being done yet. Ambassador, this is what the Washington Post said this morning. It said Cuban leaders face potentially difficult decisions on how far and fast to open to U.S. businesses and American culture. Do you think these are major concerns for Cuba's leaders? Is that what they're thinking about? How far do they allow the U.S. into Cuba?
I think they have the political will of allowing American businesses to come to Cuba. The main obstacles, as Cristina pointed out, are not on the Cuban side, but on the U.S. side. If those elements are taken off, I think we will see a lot of investment coming into Cuba, and the Cuban government not only allowing it, stimulating that investment. As to culture, come on, Cuban culture and U.S. culture have been linked together for time immemorial. Since the 19th century, we have been living together. We accept each other. I don't think that will have a negative impact and that there is anything to worry about. Listen, I am hearing Cristina, and I must say, I have a more optimistic view than she has. Having lived so long, so many years, and having seen the glass totally empty and starting to become full and then reversing back, what I have seen in the last 7 months is the glass starting to fill up, and that's what's going to happen. And when I hear Secretary Kerry and President Obama speak, I see two men who really are sensitive to what's happening in Cuba, and they want to do things. So I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in time, the forces who want to lift the embargo, who are going to start with the right to travel, the right of Americans to travel to Cuba, which can be defined in terms of constitutional rights, they're going to win the game. They're going to win in the end.
Okay, Cristina, I'm going to ask you this question. You're here visiting the United States. You're a Cuban journalist, a young Cuban journalist. When you saw that flag go up, the embassy open, what went through you at that time?
I was absolutely thrilled. It was, seeing my flag and singing the national anthem of my country here in this capital, it's symbolically speaking a recognition of a country that decided to be different.
Was it an emotional moment?
Very much, very much. I'm not talking as a journalist, I'm talking as a young Cuban that lives in Cuba, that was born in Cuba, that studied, that I'm a journalist thanks to the educational system in Cuba, and it was something absolutely emotional. But regarding to what Professor said, just a small joke. There's a joke in Latin America that says...
Very quickly.
Yes. Why don't you have coup d'etat here in the United States? You know why?
I envy Cristina.
You know why? Because you don't have an American embassy. That's an idea that's all around Latin America.
Cristina Escobar, Ambassador Carlos Alzugaray, thanks to both of you for joining us. We need to take a break right now. When we come back, we'll talk with a member of the United States Congress and a Chinese scholar about today's developments. Stay with us, you're watching The Heat.